George Lynch stepped onto the stage in the 1980s as a living paradox. While glam metal reveled in spotlights, teased hair, and speed-obsessed solos, his guitar cut through the noise, raw, sharp, like a wound that asked no permission. This was not a sound designed to please the crowd. It was restrained fury, instinct forced into discipline, something that pulled listeners in while leaving them uneasy. Talent carried George Lynch to the top with startling speed. Massive stages, multi-platinum albums, riffs that became the blueprint of American metal. Yet at the same time, another battle was unfolding quietly behind the lights. Creative clashes, commercial pressure, irreconcilable tension between an artist driven by instinct and an industry machine that cared only about what could be sold. Success arrived in waves, but with every tour, the loneliness grew heavier. But George Lynch's story does not end with glory. It continues through painful choices. He accepted being pushed aside from the greatest opportunity of his life, chose to walk away from a band at its peak, even willing to abandon the very name tied to his fame when it no longer aligned with his conscience. Every step left a scar. Every decision carried its own cost. This is not merely the story of an exceptional guitarist. It is the journey of a man perpetually caught between talent and damage, freedom and sacrifice. So how much did he have to pay to avoid losing himself? The tension between light and shadow did not appear by chance when George Lynch stepped onto the stage. It had existed long before that moment, smoldering, persistent, shaped during his earliest years when music was not yet a profession, but the only way he could endure the world around him. George Lynch was born on September 28, 1954, in Spokane, Washington, a small, cold, inward-looking city where art was neither nurtured nor encouraged. His family was not wealthy, nor did it have any musical tradition. The house he grew up in had no instruments, no rehearsal room, no one telling a young George that emotions could be released through sound. That steady, suffocating quiet made him feel alienated early on, as if he were living in a space that had no place for anything too different. Lynch's childhood was not defined by a single dramatic tragedy, but by a lingering sense of isolation. He was not a standout child, nor someone who easily belonged to a group. That difference did not erupt into open rebellion. It accumulated silently. When he first picked up a guitar at the age of 10, it was not a moment driven by ambition or dreams of fame. It felt more like a reflex, something that, for the first time, allowed him to feel alive, to release impulses he could not yet name. Music quickly became a private space that George Lynch built for himself in order to survive. He listened obsessively to the solos of Jimi Hendrix, Jeff Beck, and Eric Clapton, not to imitate them, but to search for a different language of his own. Those sounds opened up a parallel world for him, one where aggression, distortion, and instability were not treated as flaws, but as truth. When his family moved to Sacramento, California during his teenage years, the new environment did not immediately offer comfort. But it was there that George Lynch began to engage with music more actively, playing in school bands, teaching himself technique, dismantling amplifiers, experimenting with sound through instinct rather than instruction. There was no mentor, no template to follow. From early on, in his approach to the guitar carried a clear trait. He was not seeking approval, but the feeling of being himself, even if that self was rough, unpredictable, and difficult to accept. In that new space, what had once been latent began to move more clearly. Sacramento was no artistic paradise, but it was open and expansive enough for George Lynch to test his collisions with the outside world on his own terms. School, teenage bands, makeshift rehearsals in garages or rundown community rooms became the places where he first pushed his guitar beyond the private realm, not to impress, but to see whether the sound inside him could stand when placed alongside others. From his earliest sessions with peers, George already seemed ill-suited to familiar molds. He had little interest in repeating safe melodies or playing in ways that pleased teachers or small audiences. When others tried to play correctly, he searched for ways to play differently. When a band needed a smooth, supportive backdrop, George often pushed the sound towards something more jagged and unpredictable, as if deliberately testing the limits of what the space around him could tolerate. With no formal teacher and no curriculum, his path to learning the guitar was entirely instinctive. George listened to records for hours, not just to memorize melodies, but to trace how sound itself was formed. He took apart amplifiers, reassembled components, twisted effect knobs by feel rather than specification. Learning did not follow a progression, and it followed compulsion. Try, fail, listen, adjust. Out of that process, a style began to emerge. Not polished, not pretty, but layered with depth and a distinctive internal tension. During his high school years, he played in a band with a rather flamboyant name, Sergeant Rocks. The name left no lasting mark, and George himself never cared much about it. What mattered was simply playing, pushing the guitar into real air, whether in a run-down rehearsal room or on a small stage. No one would remember. It was there that his core beliefs quietly took root. A distrust of imposed structures, a constant skepticism toward aesthetic authority, and above all, the conviction that music only mattered when it carried a soul, even if that soul was rough, distorted, and uncomfortable. That defiance did not remain confined to high school rehearsal rooms. When George Lynch arrived in Los Angeles in the late 1970s, he carried the same spirit with him. No mentor, no industry backing, no safe map. The city was overflowing with great guitarists, capable bands, and dreams crowding one another for space. Lynch drifted through a succession of anonymous groups, changed rehearsal rooms as often as addresses, and played shows where the audience was so sparse it barely masked the hum of the amplifiers. There he learned how to survive through sound alone. Every step onto a stage was a trial, every night of playing a quiet reckoning with whether he truly belonged in that place. Amid that maze, the boys emerged as a fragile point of stability. The band brought no major contract, no clear path forward, but it was enough to make people inside the industry take notice of how George handled the guitar, sharp, compressed, and always carrying a sense of unease. He did not play to prove he was faster or more precise than anyone else. He played as if digging into a crack, searching for something still alive beneath the surface. That difference led him to a moment that seemed capable of changing everything. In 1982, George Lynch was invited to audition for Ozzy Osbourne's band in the post-Randy Rhoads era. The tryout was tense, heavy with unspoken expectations. Lynch came very close enough to believe the door was opening. Then the final decision landed elsewhere. Jake E. Lee was chosen, and George Lynch returned to a familiar position, standing on the sidelines, watching the biggest opportunity of his life pass by in silence. That collision left a deep mark on his sense of self, not simply because of failure, but because of the feeling of being judged by standards that had little to do with music. Los Angeles taught him a bitter lesson. Talent is not always enough, and fit can matter more than truth. From that moment, a quiet decision took shape. George Lynch stopped trying to bend himself to fit the mold. He chose the harder, lonelier road, holding on to his own guitar voice, even if it meant paying with time, lost opportunities, and long years without recognition. That refusal to bend soon carried him to another crossroads, quiet but decisive. Dokken, a singer in the process of shaping his own band, recognized in Lynch something Los Angeles both desired and feared, a guitarist with a voice so distinct it could not be easily controlled. And their collaboration was not born of personal harmony, but of mutual necessity. Don's melodic, dramatic vocals set against George's razor-edged guitar, perpetually drawn tight like a stretched wire. From their earliest sessions together, there was an unstable but compelling tension. The music was held within structure, yet something inside it constantly pressed against those boundaries. The contract with Elektra Records finally opened a door George had stood outside for years. But when Breaking the Chains was released in 1983, the friction between instinct and commercial structure was immediately apparent. The album felt like a band feeling its way forward. Songs carefully arranged, melodies accessible, Lynch's guitar kept within safe limits. There was energy, there was technique, but not yet the ferocity he carried from the underground. For George, it felt like stepping into a larger room only to be told to lower his voice. Everything changed just a year later. Tooth and Nail arrived like a kick that blew open a door left half ajar. This time, George Lynch no longer stood behind the song structures. His guitar charged straight into the center, sharp, aggressive, and emotionally exposed. The riffs were relentless, and the solos were not displays of technique alone, but carried a sense of urgency, as if every note were fighting to justify its own existence. The album not only resonated artistically, but exploded commercially, lifting George Lynch from dark rehearsal spaces straight onto radio, MTV, and major stages. At the same time, a quieter shift began to form. As success came quickly, the pressure to shape an image tightened its grip. George now had his place, his spotlight, but the sensation of being pulled back toward old limits had not disappeared. Only one thing had changed. This time he was standing at the very center of the mainstream, where every collision that followed would no longer happen in silence. That pressure did not make George Lynch hesitate. If anything, it drove him faster toward the center of his era. When Tooth and Nail went platinum, everything around George shifted into acceleration. Relentless touring schedules, one studio session bleeding into the next, and his guitar sound flooding MTV as a defining marker of American metal in the mid-1980s. No longer the outlier lurking in the margins, Lynch became a familiar face of a time when music was watched almost as much as it was heard. Under Lock and Key, released in 1985, carried the confidence of a band that now knew exactly where it stood. The album sold over 1 million copies, and this time George's guitar was not only ferocious, but more deliberately structured, sharper, as if he were learning to rein in his own impulses. The riffs grew more condensed, and the solos were placed with precision that held the listener's gaze. On music television, George Lynch appeared with his hand-painted ESP guitar, an icy stage presence, and an economy of movement, an energy without excess, enough to cement him as a guitar icon of the MTV metal era. But compromise was never a permanent instinct. Back for the attack. In 1987 opened a wider space for Lynch to dig deeper into the things that haunted him. The album was massive, ambitious, and at times heavy, much like the inner state of the man behind the guitar. Within it, Mr. Scary stood stripped of lyrics, offering no vocal shield, only guitar leading the listener through jagged emotional layers. Tension, unease, then eruption. It was not a pure technical showcase, but an inner manifesto, where the line between control and obsession became so thin it was nearly impossible to distinguish. At the same time, Dokken rose into the top tier of American metal, touring arenas alongside Motley Crue, Rat, and Scorpions, from the United States to Europe. Millions of records sold. Stadiums filled night after night. Yet as the scale expanded, the tension accumulated in quieter ways. George Lynch stood at the peak of his career, celebrated as a defining guitar voice of the era, and simultaneously hemmed in by new constraints, where every creative step carried the weight of enormous expectations hanging overhead. That pressure came not only from the market, but from a fault line at the very core of the band. As the stage lights grew brighter, two visions within Dokken drifted further apart. George Lynch was drawn toward darker musical territory, more complex structures, heightened emotional tension, technique used not for polish but for excavation. Dokken, as frontman and image-bearer, needed songs that could move directly onto radio, memorable melodies, easily replicated hooks. One wanted to push boundaries, the other needed to keep the train on its tracks. The difference did not erupt into public arguments, but manifested in longer and longer silences behind the scenes. In the studio, the atmosphere thickened. There were stretches lasting months when the two barely spoke directly. Sessions were arranged to avoid face-to-face contact, and as if simply sharing a room might warp the music itself. George Lynch, already hypersensitive to any form of control, began to withdraw whenever he felt his guitar voice being constricted. At times, he stopped recording altogether if Don was present, not as an act of rebellion, but as a defensive reflex of an artist no longer able to justify his instincts. The paradox was that as everything inside fractured, the surface reached its greatest scale. The 1988 Monsters of Rock tour placed Dokken on the same stages as giants, before roaring seas of people every night. Lynch's guitar remained sharp and ferocious, showing no outward sign of strain. But behind the stage, another reality was taking shape. Don quietly began preparing his own path, recording ideas that no longer fit within the band's structure. The separation was never formally announced, but it existed in every schedule, every decision. When the tour ended, what remained was not the question of who was right or wrong, but the realization that pretending could no longer continue. In 1989, Dokken dissolved. For many, it was the collapse of a major brand. For George Lynch, it felt entirely different. Not the loss of something, but the shedding of a skin that had grown too tight. After years suspended between success and confinement, he stepped out of the wreckage with a clarity sharper than ever. If freedom demanded a price, it was a price he was willing to pay. That feeling of shedding a skin quickly turned into action. George Lynch did not look for an existing band, nor did he wait for the market to rearrange a role for him. He built a new space himself and named it Lynch Mob, not as a brand, but as a declaration of independence. There, the guitar no longer had to negotiate with anyone, no longer needed permission from familiar structures, and no longer had to soften itself to fit radio waves. Wicked Sensation, released in 1990, carried the energy of someone finally able to breathe deeply after a long period of holding it in. The album sold over 500,000 copies and drew positive critical attention, not because it was flashy, but because it felt honest. With Oni Logan's gritty, blues-inflected vocals blending into Lynch's barbed guitar style, the music became more of an internal dialogue than a performance. The riffs were heavy without showing off. The solos felt like extended monologues. This was George Lynch in his truest form, no longer shielded by the image of a mainstream band. But freedom also brought fragility. Oni Logan left the group early, leaving behind a void that was not easily filled. It wasn't just the loss of a singer, but the loss of a creative counterweight capable of balancing a personality as forceful as Lynch's. From there, a cycle of vocalist changes began. Each new voice added a different color, but also fractured the band's identity again and again. George continued creating relentlessly, but without a stable anchor for those ideas to crystallize into something enduring. As the 1990s unfolded, the external landscape shifted even faster than the band itself. Grunge and alternative surged forward, sweeping away the metal that had once dominated MTV. Rather than adapt by reshaping his sound to match the times, George Lynch chose to step back. Lynch Mob continued to release albums. Lynch Mob, 1992, then a hiatus, then Smoke This, 1999, Revolution, 2003, Smoke and Mirrors, 2009, each record a different slice of the same mindset, following no one, making no attempt to return to former spotlights. In this phase, Lynch Mob gradually drifted away from the idea of being a chart-competing band. It became a personal laboratory, where George experimented with structure, rhythm, and emotion without regard for taste, at times raw, at times off-kilter, at times almost deliberately resistant to easy listening. Yet the instability persisted, but not from a lack of direction, rather from his acceptance of constant motion, where music existed as a process rather than a destination. Choosing to remain on the margins throughout the 1990s did not drain George Lynch's energy. It prepared him for another phase, one in which he no longer tied himself to any fixed structure. From the early 2000s onward, Lynch emerged as a true musical nomad, moving between projects not to reclaim old glory, but to place his guitar into new contexts, challenging enough to keep him from repeating himself. KXM, formed in 2014, was among his boldest moves. Alongside Doug Pinnick and Ray Luzier, Lynch entered a space shaped by prog, funk, and groove metal, where the guitar no longer functioned as a showboating centerpiece, but as part of a dense, distorted, conversational sound structure. KXM's albums were not easy listens and resisted clear categorization, yet they carried the depth Lynch had always pursued, music as a stream of consciousness, unconcerned with market approval. In parallel, Sweet and Lynch placed him at the opposite pole, melodic hard rock and AOR, clearer melodies, greater restraint, focused on emotion and spiritual depth rather than pure technical tension. Not a contradiction, but two sides of the same composer who had learned when silence mattered. With The End Machine, George reunited with Jeff Pilson and Mick Brown, familiar pieces but in a different frame of mind. The music breathed classic hard rock without attempting to recreate Dokken. There was no longer a need to prove who had been right or wrong, only the maturity of musicians who had traveled far enough to understand what they needed from one another. Alongside these musical projects, Mr. Scary Guitars emerged as another declaration, each instrument handcrafted, non-repetitive, carrying unmistakable personal marks. Here, George Lynch was no longer a performer for the crowd, but a craftsman embedding his spirit into objects designed to produce sound. That clarity of values inevitably brought controversy. His conflict-laden relationship with Don Dokken continued to be followed by the media for years, like a fracture that never fully healed. In 2018, Lynch placed himself back at the center of controversy by publicly accusing PV Electronics of using prison labor. Legal pressure followed. Demands for retraction were issued. But he did not back down, a familiar choice for someone who had never ranked comfort as a top priority. 2 years later, his decision to abandon the name Lynch Mob due to its historical association with racial violence provoked further backlash. For George Lynch, it was not an act of image management, but a moral boundary he could not ignore, even if the price was losing a brand inseparable from his name. Across these choices, and a clearer image emerges, an artist who does not seek consensus, who does not bargain with his conscience for convenience. The shape of the music may change, projects may come and go, but the axis of values does not shift. Quality and truth always come before commerce, even when that path is rough, confrontational, and full of collision. As George Lynch moved deeper into a later creative phase, one no longer governed by the album tour media cycle, his personal life also shifted onto a quieter trajectory. In 2011, as he largely stepped away from the familiar rotations of old glam metal, focused on independent projects, and spent more time in California, Christina Heath entered his life. Their meeting was not tied to music, nor accompanied by stage lights or public attention. The connection formed at a time when George Lynch had grown accustomed to silence, to a rhythm of living that did not require witnessing or validation from an audience. Between 2012 and 2013, as Lynch devoted much of his time to guitar building and moved intermittently between early-stage projects such as KXM, the relationship with Christina Heath developed in a private space, deliberately removed from the media. This period also coincided with his ongoing confrontation with unresolved tensions from the past. Unfinished conflicts with Dokken, disputes over artistic positions, and a long-standing sense of being misunderstood. Christina entered his life not as the woman behind the artist, but as part of his everyday existence, a space where George did not need to maintain an image or defend himself with the familiar armor of a sharp-edged persona. In 2014, the same year KXM released its debut album and Lynch fully entered his phase as a true musical nomad, he and Christina Heath married. The marriage was not announced publicly, not attached to media events or curated images, reflecting precisely how George Lynch chose to exist at this stage of life: private, controlled, and resistant to turning personal life into brand material. There is no confirmed information regarding children from this relationship, and Lynch himself has remained completely silent about family details. In the years that followed, married life unfolded alongside a George Lynch who grew increasingly firm in both moral and creative positions. When he publicly criticized PV Electronics in 2018, accepting fierce backlash from the industry, and especially when he abandoned the name Lynch Mob in 2020, Christina Heath remained beside him during a period when every choice carried tangible losses. These were not only financial or reputational costs, but the accumulated mental exhaustion of years spent refusing compromise. Differences in pace, in how conflict was faced, between a man accustomed to absolute freedom and a relationship that demanded stability, created quiet tensions, never told through scandal, yet deep enough to leave lasting marks. From 2018 onward, George Lynch and Christina Heath no longer appeared together, and the marriage ended in divorce. There was no official statement, no public dispute, consistent with how Lynch has always handled personal ruptures, withdrawing silently from the frame. After the marriage closed, George Lynch returned to a familiar state, an artist living largely alone within his own creative rhythm, continuing to build guitars, collaborating selectively, and keeping his private life at a distance far enough to avoid being consumed as part of a public narrative. In the mid-1980s, when Dokken was exploding across radio, MTV, and arena tours, George Lynch met Terry Kuniff at a time when his life was almost entirely swallowed by the speed of success. Schedules were relentless, studios became battlegrounds, and Lynch's creative personality grew sharper, increasingly difficult to reconcile. Their relationship formed within that same tempo, urgent, tense, constantly propelled forward by the pressure of a band rising at breakneck speed. By 1987, as Dokken reached its commercial peak with Back for the Attack and George Lynch became one of the most talked-about guitarists in America, he and Terry Kuniff married. Their shared life unfolded in a context where the boundary between the man and the stage image had nearly vanished. George Lynch did not enter family life from a place of stability. He carried with him the anxiety of an artist who felt increasingly pulled away from the center of his own creativity, along with unresolved conflicts with Dokken simmering beneath the band's greatest success. Terry lived alongside a man who was rarely truly home, even when physically present. Lynch's inner life remained trapped in sound, schedules, and endless internal confrontations within the band. The year 1988 marked a widening of fractures. The Monsters of Rock tour brought Dokken to the largest stages of its career, while pushing George Lynch's private life into a prolonged state of rigidity. Creative pressure, internal conflict, and the feeling of being controlled musically and commercially made him increasingly withdrawn, difficult to communicate with, and hard to reach emotionally. Married life no longer functioned as refuge. It became another space where silence accumulated. Dokken's breakup in 1989 did not bring relief to his personal relationship. It merely exposed wounds that had long been compressed beneath momentum. In 1991, they divorced, without legal spectacle, without public statements, again consistent with how George Lynch typically handled personal collapse, cutting ties, retreating, and redirecting all remaining energy into music. The separation coincided with the formation of Lynch Mob, as if the collapse of one life structure immediately demanded the construction of a new creative one. Terry Kuniff exited George Lynch's story as he transitioned from a glam metal star into an artist, fiercely reclaiming control over his identity, leaving behind the aftershocks of a relationship crushed beneath the velocity of fame, professional conflict, and a man who had never learned how to slow down. Tracing the thread of his life further back, to the period before Dokken's collapse, leads to Emily Armstrong, the woman who shared George Lynch's life while he was still caught between creative ambition and the pressure of surviving within a band structure that was growing increasingly constrictive. In the early 1980s, when Lynch had entered the professional circuit but had not yet reached commercial peak, he met Emily Armstrong during a phase that was still relatively ordinary. Small to mid-sized shows, long studio days without the protective glare of fame. The relationship formed while George Lynch was still an ambitious musician not yet fully distorted by success. And Emily entered his life as part of a world outside music, a place where he could still pause, listen, and exist as a person not yet reduced to a label. By 1984, as Tooth and Nail began pulling Dokken and George Lynch out of the underground, the two married. Their shared life unfolded alongside a career accelerating beyond control. Lynch brought home not only the exhilaration of success, but also the accumulated tension of extended recording sessions, endless arguments over music, and the growing sense that his creative identity was being forced into a mold. Emily Armstrong lived beside a man constantly split in two. On stage, a guitar icon of a new era. Off stage, a volatile personality, withdrawn, unpredictable, and rarely able to fully escape the noise inside his head. During 1985 to 1986, as Under Lock and Key pushed Dokken into multi-million sales and touring schedules became relentlessly draining, cracks in the marriage grew increasingly visible. George Lynch lived almost permanently on the road, moving between airports, hotels, and studios, while internal band conflicts slowly hardened into sustained psychological pressure. Shared space narrowed, physical presence no longer guaranteed connection. Differences in how each endured that pace became a quiet but persistent source of strain. Lynch was never someone who articulated his inner life easily. Instead, he retreated inward, letting the guitar speak in place of words. By 1987, when Back for the Attack carried Dokken to its final commercial peak, the relationship with Emily Armstrong had reached a point of no return. External success could not mend internal fractures. If anything, it exposed more clearly the misalignment between a man consumed by creative and commercial conflict and a marriage that required steady presence. The marriage ended in divorce in 1988, without public drama, without press explanations, just a silent withdrawal, consistent with the way George Lynch typically closed chapters that could no longer continue. The separation occurred just before tensions with Dokken erupted fully and led to the band's dissolution. Emily Armstrong exited George Lynch's life as he was entering one of his most intense periods, professionally and psychologically, and leaving behind a relationship eroded by the velocity of success, prolonged silence, and a man who had never learned how to balance creative freedom with shared life. In recent years, George Lynch's rhythm has no longer revolved around packed tour schedules or strategic meetings. He remains in California, in a space distant enough to escape the noise, yet close enough to touch music every day. Mornings often begin with short motorcycle rides along familiar roads, where nature opens up as a necessary breath after decades spent in studios and backstage corridors. Most of the remaining time is devoted to his guitar workshop, a place where wood, metal strings, and surface scars are left visible. Each instrument is built as a living object, carrying the imprint of hand and mood, not for display, but to produce sound that reflects who he is now. Alongside that quieter rhythm, Lynch Mob, the final ride unfolded as a parallel current. From February 1st, 2024, to March 22nd, 2025, the farewell tour moved through the United States and Australia, with stops including the Monsters of Rock cruise. It did not carry the tone of gentle nostalgia, but rather felt like a direct confrontation with the road already traveled. On stage, the guitar sound was not polished for memory. It remained rough, shifting night to night, reflecting a player unwilling to repeat himself. During the same period, a new album and a live DVD were completed, capturing a band that chose to end in motion rather than with a full stop. The year 2024 also saw the release of the Quantum Phase by The End Machine, where George Lynch reunited with longtime collaborators in a more mature, densely layered form, a one that did not attempt to reconstruct the past, but placed technique in service of emotion. Outside the studio, he appeared at guitar workshops not as an instructor delivering a method, but as an artist sharing how to listen to sound before touching the fretboard. At the same time, the Electric Ritual project expanded his creative boundaries into visual art. Guitars became storytelling objects, linking recorded sound with image, memory, and sensation, a way of playing music through the eyes and intuition as much as through the hands. George Lynch's legacy does not reside in the number of albums sold, nor is it measured by awards, metrics he was never truly chasing in the first place. That legacy exists in his refusal to be defined. In an era when metal guitar was swept into speed, polish, and formula, Lynch introduced something more uncomfortable: unease, distortion, and a personality unwilling to please. His sound did not aim to be beautiful, but to be honest. Honest to anger, to doubt, to the darker spaces many artists chose to conceal. From Mr. Scary to the jagged leads of Lynch Mob, and onward to the dense, searching experiments of KXM and The End Machine, George Lynch's guitar always bears the imprint of a person interrogating himself. That influence spread without proclamation. Generations of guitarists learned from him not how to play faster, but how to listen differently, to hear strings ringing slightly out of alignment, to hear the silence between notes, to hear unresolved tension embedded within a riff. Lynch left behind a rare model in American rock, a musician willing to trade brand power, central position, even convenience itself, simply to retain the right to say no. He demonstrated that a long career does not have to be a straight ascent. It can be a series of difficult choices, sometimes solitary but grounded in truth. As the noise of the era shifted, as glam metal receded, as even his own name became a subject of controversy, George Lynch kept moving, building guitars by hand, sharing technique as conversation rather than doctrine, pushing the guitar into visual space, and stepping onto the stage one last time with Lynch Mob without asking nostalgia for permission. There, legacy is not sealed in the past. It is still being practiced. And if one image remains after everything, it is that of an artist who chose to go all the way with his identity, even when the path was far rougher than the safe, familiar route. What George Lynch guitar moment do you remember most? A riff, a solo, or a feeling that's hard to name? Leave a comment. And if you want to keep exploring stories about artists who dare to live honestly through sound, don't forget to follow the channel.